It's an enormous privilege to be with you, and this morning we're going to focus in this first session on the last part of Matthew 25. Now, Matthew 24 and 25 together are sometimes called the eschatological discourse, that is, the discourse about last things. But when you look at those two chapters carefully, you discover that half of Matthew 24 is really about last things, and I don't have time to unpack that part at all. But from halfway through 24 all the way to the end of 25, that is a chapter and a half, it's all about how to wait for the end. In other words, it's not about the end exactly, but it's about how to wait for the end. Before I read our passage, let me ask a question and reflect on it with you. How does our culture envisage the end of the world? Shall we see ourselves choking to death in our own pollution? Following the spirals of decadence and decay and meaninglessness, powerfully portrayed, for example, by T.S. Eliot. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. Of course, he wrote in the days before nuclear holocaust. So shall we think less in terms of T.S. Eliot than in terms of nuclear holocaust? On the beach, for example, nuclear exchanges and eventually the entire planet dies, or one of the new films of catastrophe that are circulating quite nicely? Or shall we project billions of years into the future after our sun burns out? Will the whole human race colonize other planets? We think less in terms of T.S. Eliot than Isaac Asimov or Star Wars or the like. But all that seems very remote, so most of us don't really think much about that in any case. If we're going to think about the end, we think only of our own end. How should we think of our own end? And then we may fight, like Dylan Thomas, who counsels his dying father, do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should rage against the dying of the light. Rage against the dying of the light. Or worst of all, what many of us do in the Western world is simply refuse to think about these things at all. They're simply suppressed. We live for today. Even amongst us who are Christians, even when we confess that Jesus is coming again, and we may actually sing hymns anticipating it from time to time. Yet whether or not that anticipation works out in terms of how we live or not is another issue. We can be confessing believers and functioning atheists in terms of changing how we live. Some, of course, simply scoff at all such notions of Christ's return and the end of the age and resurrection existence. Paul, however, says that belief in the fact that we shall have resurrection bodies in the new heaven and the new earth is a necessary correlate to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. He ties the two together so tightly that if you hold that Jesus rises from the dead, then you must see this as the first step toward the resurrection that we will experience at the end. You can't have one without the other. But at the end of the day, my brief this morning is not to talk so much about the end per se as to how to wait for the end.